Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed, the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today I've got a guest on and we're going to be doing a reaction video to a video put out by a Muslim apologist. So I've got Nimai on. Nimai,
hello.
Thanks for joining me. And the video we're reacting to is from the Muslim skeptic. I'm not sure what his actual name is. I should probably say that. The Muslim skeptic. We should have this guy's name, eh?
Yeah, maybe we retry that.
Yeah, I'll just edit all these bits out. How do I find his name? No, I don't want to join his Telegram. Oh, well, I'll probably just record another intro bit. Okay. All right. So should we start with the gory bits or should we start with the other stuff?
Wherever you want to go.
So this video, he's arguing about the curse of polytheism, and he gives a bunch of arguments that don't stand up. So I think we'll play the beginning bit last. So let's just see, where are we here?
Strictly worshiping one God.
I'll edit all these bits out. We don't need all the filler.
Of all religions, Islam is unique in its staunch condemnation of polytheism in all its forms. No religion takes a harder stance against polytheism. Islam teaches that the greatest injustice is polytheism or shirk, and the greatest virtue is strict monotheism or tawheed.
Do you want to comment on that?
Well, the thing I find interesting in that regard is that within Islam, within the cosmology that's put forward within Islam, there's a hierarchy of beings going from God down through the angels, the kodams, down to jinn, and so on and so forth. So there is a hierarchy of beings. So if you were to go to any of the other, what they would call polytheism or polytheistic religions or cosmologies, it's basically an acknowledgement of the hierarchy of beings, and people are naturally feeling some inclination or kinship with certain groups of beings, which is not unlike the world as it is. So I don't actually see it all that different, except that they're saying that the highest good is to have undeviated devotion towards the supreme being, and that's really not any different from Hinduism. That's pretty standard.
Right. So it's like they're pointing out a difference that isn't actually there. But
there's no difference.
The thing they're doing differently is they're poo-pooing people who they disagree with.
Yeah, I mean, like Krishna says it in the Bhagavad Gita when he says, according to according to gunas, people worship. So according to the quality of their consciousness, people are attracted to various modes of worship, and the object of the worship becomes in a sense, the destination. So those who worship spirits go to the spirits. Those who worship the demigods go to the demigods. But the highest is those who worship Brahman. They come to me. So in essence, they're saying the same thing. There's no difference between the two theologies.
What is it that they're saying which is different from what we're saying? Because we don't go around making that claim that they just made.
I don't even understand how he can make the claim relative to the other Abrahamic religions. How is Islam, and maybe this is a question I'm ignorant of, how is Islam more anti-polytheism than Christianity or Judaism?
Yeah, that's a really good question too.
To say that they're the most like where in Christianity is there an allowance for polytheism? Where in Judaism is there an allowance for polytheism? And which way are they polytheistic?
It's like they pretend that if you acknowledge the existence of beings other than God who are not ordinary and have some unique powers, that we're somehow betraying God.
Yeah, pretty much.
So,
When in their own philosophy, in a sense, that those beings are working in, like the angels are essentially like God's emissaries. Their philosophy is that Muhammad received the Quran from the Archangel Michael. So then does that mean to acknowledge Michael would be polytheism?
yeah, I mean, part of it might be a vocabulary problem. In their own books, they actually take the time to understand the nuance. But when it comes to other people's books, they just take the most uncharitable reading possible and have no time to learn what it actually means.
If we were being generous with them, if you take certain, you could say, schools of Hinduism where all the deities are equated, where the cosmology is equated, where the differences in the deities or beings is simply an aesthetic or a flavor change, then you might say, oh, that you can worship any of these and it's all the same. You could maybe argue that's polytheism. But the thing about Hinduism is it's not a classic polytheism, because even if when you do that, in that school of thought, the ultimate conclusion is that Brahman is the supreme being, and that Brahman takes many forms, including you and I. And at the end of the day, there's one absolute truth, which is acknowledged and can be acknowledged in many ways. If that's the school of thought that you're actually complaining or attacking in the equation of all these deities, and you say, oh, but there isn't a classic polytheism as you would be taught it in Hinduism, for the most part, not in any of the writing.
But we could grant them that their objections land on certain versions of Hinduism, but that doesn't mean they can say Islam.
Not really. Not you. I would still argue that the thing that's fundamentally different between Islam and the Abrahamic religions and the East is non-duality. The Eastern religions, the fundamental basis is non-duality. It's one truth being expressed in multiplicity, but it's always one truth, and it never stops being the one truth. Whereas in a dualistic system, there's absolute difference between God and his creation.
So that's one debate that could be had. I'm just saying we could park that debate and still say
I understand
their argument has no grounds.
That's the fundamental. So when you start attacking polytheism, when you're looking at Hinduism, and you're attacking their practices, and you're saying that they don't worship one absolute supreme being, you're wrong. You're always going to be wrong on almost all counts in Hinduism, because they're all based on non-duality. So there's always one absolute truth that's acknowledged. So in essence, it's always monotheistic, always.
Right. But the point I'm making is part of their argument is an ignorance to the diversity you find in religions like Hinduism, where you also find versions similar to what they're professing. So their claim to uniqueness fails.
True.
Let's play some more of the video.
But what is so unjust about worshiping multiple gods? And what is so morally good about strictly worshiping one god? We live in a world that has whitewashed polytheism. People think that the only difference between a monotheistic religion like Islam and polytheism is Muslims have a mosque that doesn't have idols in it, whereas Hindus, Buddhists, and pagans have temples with colorful statues. Why get so worked up about this difference? What's the big deal? If you believe in multiple gods versus believing in one all-powerful God, that has a huge impact on your psychology. Unlike the polytheist, the true monotheist, namely the Muslim, worships only one all-powerful God. This one God has created him and everything else that...
Sorry.
So again, he's arguing against something that's not there.
Yeah.
It's like, show me.
I mean, the Abrahamic traditions do have some views which differ from many other monotheistic traditions. So maybe he could say the Abrahamic traditions have a few unique features that you don't find elsewhere. But he's not even doing that. He's saying just Islam.
Well, indeed, absolutely. But then he's describing Hinduism and Buddhism, like the only ism in there that maybe we could argue is a polytheism. But the reality is we don't have enough remaining information to actually make that judgment, which is paganism. We don't even know really what their religion was. We only have accounts from Roman historians who were basically writing propaganda for Rome. and so we have next to nothing, and we don't know really much of anything, really of any depth of what those religious traditions were about. So I would not even make I don't know if they're truly polytheistic or not. If you're, most of these traditions in a sense are acknowledging the structure of the cosmos and the structure of the hierarchy of beings in one way or another, or in Hinduism would be literally the structure of consciousness and its various ways it gets embodied and functions. And those are all deified. And so, but it's always one absolute truth, one supreme being. It's Om Purnamada Purnamidam. It's always the complete balance, one supreme being. So he's arguing with, he's shadow boxing. It's a non-existent, like a non-existent opponent. It's not true.
Exists. This one God has given him the eyes he sees with, the ears he hears with, the heart pumping in his chest, and is the sole provider of literally everything he has.
That's a claim you find in almost all religions, right?
We all agree.
This understanding creates a very specific dynamic between God and the believer, a relationship built on feelings of intense love and deep gratitude. The believer is in a state of utter appreciation, knowing that whatever he is, whatever he has, whatever he'll ever reach is from one.
Yeah, more things you'll find in multiple world religions.
Yeah, we all agree on that.
Single God. When people accept that every happiness and joy they experience is from one all-loving deity, all of their appreciation is concentrated towards him. They, in turn, direct all their worship.
You should read Bhagavad Gita, hey?
Pretty much.
So exclusively.
He's not arguing with. It's like it's a straw man at best. At best.
He gets past having terrible arguments and moves on. Just baseless claims, and then gives some terrible arguments later, and the arguments are going to be fun to reply to.
To him. This naturally produces a beautiful relationship with God, one with overwhelming love, gratitude, devotion, and obedience. The temptation is to say that this kind of love is part of every religion. That is false. It's not part of every religion. This is whitewashing polytheism. In polytheism, most deities have no role in a person's life. They're not responsible for food that you eat, air you breathe. They aren't responsible for the order of the universe that ensures the sun rises and sets. In polytheism, most gods are localized. with limited power. There's a god for the sea, another god for the sky, or a small god for your specific family.
That sounds like what he's... Whoa. Have you... Did I lose you?
I think I was going the whole time. I don't know what, but yeah, you definitely, that's the right side of the screen dropped.
Oh, okay, yeah, you dropped out of the screen. Okay, I think the connection was bad for a sec. Okay, what was I gonna say? Something I was gonna say.
Power. There's a god for the sea.
Oh yeah, it sounds like his argument here amounts to the same logic you could use to argue that if you believe Bill Gates exists, then you're taking glory away from God. You know, you're believing in a local God. You know, or the belief in the existence of Elon Musk.
Even going back to their philosophy, why didn't God go himself to Muhammad? Why did Michael have to do it?
Exactly, yeah. So the idea that there's other people doing things in the cosmos does not mean...
On behalf of God.
Yeah.
How is that a problem?
Yeah, exactly.
Another god for the sky, or a small god for your specific family. These are weak gods that offer you...
Is the translation of Deva itself. He's translating Deva, which is generally translated as God with either a big G or a little g, whereas Deva's the most literal meaning is like a light giver, or you know, you could even say a being of light, or the givers of light. And usually the principal Devas are all involved in animating the body in one way or another and are facilitating conscious experience. So they're light givers. He's taking it as gods.
Yeah, so it's a vocabulary problem again.
Big time.
He's taking the time to understand what the words like, what is it, Elohim, or what's the Arabic? What that word means in his tradition, but not taking the time to understand what the word Deva means in our tradition.
Yeah. Which is coming from, you know, divya, light. It's illuminating. They're the illuminators.
Nothing. The deities in polytheism are so weak that often they can't even feed themselves. They require sacrifices in the form of food, alcohol.
That one is so ridiculous. I'm not even like, we're gonna pass right by that one.
No, it deserves a comment. I mean, even someone new to Krishna consciousness might ask, like, why is God needing all this service?
Well, the point is that God doesn't need the service, actually. You need to engage in service. There's a difference. It's beneficial for you to engage in sacrifice, you to engage consciously in acknowledging the Supreme Being and actively participating. Worship is active participation. And there's levels of worship, from external ritual into deepening meditation. The highest stages of sacrifice involve deep, complete meditation. I think we've dropped out again. Are we still there?
Yeah, we're still here. Yeah.
So samadhi is the ultimate state of yoga, wherein all the senses have withdrawn from the external world and have gone deep into your inner world, and where you're offering your consciousness into consciousness, and it's a full internal experience. And so worship goes from external to internal depending on where you are in that process. And also it is active. So, you know, like, how would you have a relationship with your child if there was never an interaction of actual physical affection or physical love? Or even they go to the mosque and they're offering obeisances, these are all kind of sacrifice. And they'll be, again, it comes down to understanding what is the ritual that's taking place. What does it mean when they're offering milk? For example, we see these images of them bathing the deity with milk. What does that mean? Why do they do that? None of these questions are being asked. That the assumption is that somehow or other that God requires that in order for his sustenance. This is interestingly enough, this is a philosophy that Hiranyakashipu in the Puranas, one of these great demons, he thought that was also the way it worked. So in order to try to kill God, he killed all the Brahmanas to stop the sacrifice, and that way he thought God would be very hungry and wouldn't be able to defend himself. So it was a ridiculous argument there, and it's an even more, it's hilarious.
Right. Yeah. So God doesn't need us to bathe or feed him, but
it's
in order for us
to engage,
to have a loving relationship with him, he accepts love from us in that way.
Yeah, and there's also the acknowledgement that God is the root of all good, and therefore, when one offers to God what you offer to God, you then receive as prashad, in the sense that it's that if you Srila Prabhupada would say, if you water the root, then the whole tree and all the leaves and all the fruits and everything is produced. So it starts with the acknowledgement of God and participation in worship of God.
Yeah, I mean, I like analogies to children here, because there's a way in which parents are not needing things from the children, kind of like how God doesn't need things from the parents, but sorry, God doesn't need things from his devotees, but the child takes the father's money, goes out and buys something for the father and gives it to him. What's being given is love. It's not like the belt or the tie is being given to the father. There's a loving exchange there. Or my 3-year-old brings me home pictures he drew at kindy. I don't need little scribbles. I don't have a need for little scribbles on bits of paper. But what's happening there is he's offering me some love.
And there's a cultivation of an attitude, right? Your son is at an early age. If that were the case, he's cultivating, reciprocal affection. He's cultivating, appreciation. He's cultivating generosity. He's cultivating so many different qualities and traits within himself by doing that. And therefore, it's not just a belt. It's not just a birthday.
All right, let's do some more of the video.
Alcohol or blood. This is what libations are for. In many cases, traditional polytheism involves appeasing spirit beings and literal demons. For example, you make an offering to the sea demons so they don't destroy your boat. In the theology of polytheism, you get no benefit from these.
Oh, sorry, one sec. My wife doesn't know where our pet rabbits have gone. Hopefully they turn up. Did you want to comment on that bit?
Well, at that bit, it's not exactly wrong. There are traditions that will worship spirits. There are traditions. You can go to Africa and go to shamanistic traditions that will, essentially sacrifice animals, chickens, to spirits for various things. That's called, in Bhagavad Gita, that would call that religiosity in the mode of darkness. So he's not wrong in that sense there.
Right. Yeah. But
he's lumping it all together as if
together.
That even within polytheism, that there couldn't be a spectrum. It's all one thing. So again, there's the problem.
It's really funny when apologists will criticize one tradition and give arguments which members of that same tradition will give against those parts of that same tradition. It's like there's versions of Hinduism which we have arguments against, and then a Christian or Muslim comes along and says, "Oh, Hinduism is bad," and then gives an argument that we agree with, even though we're Hindus of sorts.
But you can what I find somewhat lacking is there isn't a description, there isn't a nuance to what, it's like there's good and bad, and that's that. Whereas if you were to go to Krishna's description of it, he would say there's this spectrum, and there's a spectrum of people on a spectrum of consciousness levels, which will approach the spectrum of worship. And Krishna would say that it would be appropriate to those, actually each of those in their own right are appropriate to the people of those type of things. This is something in Jaiva Dharma as well, when there's a portion in there describing various modes of worship, from the animist traditions of worshiping the trees or animals like leopards or something, seeing God in a leopard, or and that each of those places, or each of those kinds of worship, are attractive to a person on a particular platform of conscious experience, and they're in a particular guna. They have a quality of their consciousness, and so that's where they're at. Now you can make the argument that there is a spectrum of higher and lower modes of worship, and that would be true. But you'd still have to acknowledge that there's people on a spectrum of conscious experience, and that what is good, like I wouldn't say that my religion is the best religion and everybody should do my religion. I would say that my religion is certainly best for me, but it might not be appropriate for someone. And if you're dedicated Muslim and you have great faith in Allah, and that inspires you to love God, then that's probably very good for you.
So there'd be elements there which are just diversity of flavor. So some differences of taste are not on a hierarchy. They're just differences in taste. And then other things would fall on a hierarchy, and there would be gradual stages of elevation.
Well, it becomes the object that's worshipped is a larger and larger container of the absolute truth.
Like the worshiping the bits that were just pointed out in the video there,
Yeah.
about worshiping demons and so on. That's for people in a lower stage, and at least they're acknowledging there's something greater than themselves, and they're making some advancement.
Yeah, even if it looks like they're going backwards, if you were to accept reincarnation and the eternal possibility of as many lifetimes as you possibly can need, that evolution is going on, and it's always moving forward in the direction of God, actually. So that would be an Eastern perspective.
All right, let's keep going.
These gods, and the only reason you worship them is to ward off their evil. How could you love gods like this or have any gratitude towards them? You might even hate these gods. Polytheistic religions have this inherent ugliness. It's the complete opposite of monotheism. The thing about believing in one all-powerful God who has created you and controls the universe, that gives you a strong sense of fear as well as humility. This is a natural human reaction. We all naturally fear and are humble before strong authorities who have great power to harm or benefit. This is why monotheism puts the fear of God in you. When you truly believe that God is all-powerful, you are filled with this indescribable awe of the divine.
So how is that much different? It's an ironic sequence here, because he just said that in polytheism they have these deities that are terrible and fearful, and you're doing these oblations because you're afraid of them. And then he followed that with, when there's this great being and he's so great, then you're automatically fearful and humble. And because he's so great, you're fearful and humble. How is that much different?
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of the point I was going to make when we did this reaction video, which is a lot of the arguments he gave, I'm like, that's a bit rich coming from a Muslim. Like, you're the ones that are all peace and rainbows, are you? really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I I I wouldn't make that argument, although you historically certainly could. I don't know enough about the esoteric parts of Islam to that I would make that argument. It would be, but historically, certainly that could be said.
Well, it's
There's enough jihad. I mean, jihad is a religious principle in Islam, so it's hard to, you can't really argue with that.
I'll just draw out the logic, which is, let's say his argument is something like this: polytheism creates problems in the world,
Right.
and he gives his logical argument of how the problems follow from polytheism, whatever. But if we look at people who practice polytheism, some of them are problematic and some of them are wonderful.
Or they're people, and they might be more or less the same.
Yeah. I'm saying some polytheists are great and some polytheists are problematic, just like every other human being.
So,
but if we look at Islam, can you really say Islam doesn't create problems in society? I obviously we want to say there's Sufism, there's lots of, there's a great Islamic tradition.
I would say that
so
if the world, they might argue, if I was being generous, they would argue that if the whole world was Islamic, it would be a wonderful place. Then
right.
you'd have to say, well, if we went to places that were pretty much entirely Islamic, are they wonderful places? And then we would argue that, well, you still have cruelty, and we still have, lust, anger, greed, delusion, so on and so forth. Are they much better? I don't know. It seems like a human condition and a human condition.
Well, yeah. If we go to a place that's full of Chaitanya Vaishnavas, is it any better?
That's a question worth asking. And sometimes you're going to say yes, and sometimes you're going to say no, and there's going to be a recognition that a conditioned human, a conditioned soul is a conditioned soul is a conditioned soul. And you're going to also argue that pure intention is universal and that it has universal results. Humility is universal and it has universal results. Virtue is universal and has universal results. And it's not, there's no religious or even atheistic ideology that has a monopoly on that.
Well, the question would be which religious tradition or which religious praxis or principles or philosophies have the best success rate at bringing about those transformations in consciousness.
Yep. The difficulty I would say in testing that would be cultural backgrounds. So again, it goes back to Krishna's argument, which is that different religious principles are better or worse or in a sense, they function for different kinds of people. So Yudhisthira makes the claim that, one religion for all is the greatest hypocrisy. The one dharma for all is the greatest hypocrisy. So I don't know that you will find that there's one religious tradition that's better for everyone always. That there's going to be different kinds of people, and that would be my. If you tried to test it, I don't know that it would work.
Well, if we're objective, you look around the world and you see great saints produced by a wide variety of religious traditions.
Absolutely.
I think there are some religious traditions which you see a little bit less fanaticism and violence resulting.
I think you'll see religious traditions that are more locked in dogmas, and you'll find religious traditions that were institutionalized a lot longer, and therefore you're going to run into problems of institution.
So you could chalk that up to social factors rather than anything about the tradition specifically.
Yeah, you would have to acknowledge that, and you would also have to. There's the play of esoteric and exoteric, and you could say the mystical versus the orthodox, and the role of revelation in religious tradition and whether or not traditions leave room for revelation, leave room for the mystical, for the religious experience and what that brings to a tradition and how that grows. It's not a little thing that the Eastern traditions tend to be passed on through, these what would be called a parampara, or the disciplic succession from a realized master to a realized master, or to a student who becomes, through his teachings, a realized master, and so on and so forth. And
That's
each
a good
have
point.
their realization. And so it's not just that you're dependent on a book that was written however many years ago, and that you have to stick to the word for word for word for word for word. That book is a constant revelation, and that there's someone who that book is being revealed to constantly, and they can thus guide a tradition if there's enough room for the mystical, for the religious experience to be accommodated. Or, the thing about India that I find most interesting in this regard is that it's, in a sense, the most diverse because of this. It's the least locked into just the words of any religious tradition I know. So the arguments that like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins would make against, the divine ordinance of Scripture and the unchangeable divine ordinance of Scripture, even though there is elements of that within the Hindu tradition, the tradition itself shows by its own example. If you go to Bhagavad Gita, Krishna himself is ridiculing elements of the Vedic tradition of its time, and saying how that tradition, as it was given in the past, now appears to be lost.
Yeah,
so even in its own tradition, it's built into it the knowledge that time is all devouring, even to religious scriptures, and that through realization they constantly get updated, and therefore you have a what appears like a multiplicity of religious umbrella of Hinduism.
Yeah, that's a really
and change.
That's a really good point about the parampara, how it's handed down through realized masters. There's a Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati quote which could be understood along the lines of religious institution is a necessary evil.
Yeah.
Whereas what we find in the Abrahamic traditions is a big focus on dogma being set in stone and church authority. And that's also where we tend to find a lot of the problems resulting from religious wars and fanaticism.
Yeah, and we'll find the same within, the Eastern traditions that become institutionalized. The evil of institution is just they're always going to endeavor to self-sustain first rather than serve the truth first.
Yeah.
So they're going to have to lean on dogma. They're going to have to lean on for their own, they'll sustain themselves. They'll look for their own self-preservation before they serve the ultimate truth. That's the history.
Yeah.
So where it gets institutionalized, even in the East, you're going to run into the same problems.
Reminds me of what I saw when I studied the holy name controversy, and when the Orthodox Church in Russia was persecuting some of its own members for their belief in the divinity of the holy name. And then a few short years later, the Bolshevik revolution happened, and those same church leaders were no longer worried about church dogma. They just didn't want to be persecuted by the state. So they just when the
Orthodox digression, but what was the controversy?
The documentary I produced on it didn't get so much into the theological arguments over it, but it was I touched on it briefly at the end of the video. But basically, the Imya Slavi, which is the Russian word for the name glorifiers, name worshiper, is the invective, because you're only supposed to worship God, or there's something, the holy name is one with his essence, but I get lost.
But they're trying to make a distinction between the name and God himself, and so the group of people that worship the name would say the name and God are the same.
They
And
still
then
make a little distinction. They're still like the essence of God, which is like ineffable. So the name is just one step beyond that. But whereas the I can't remember the name for the opposers, the ones that were criticizing them, they were saying, no, the name of Jesus is just an ordinary name, just like any other name. And of course, when you say that, the Slavia get really upset because it's like, now you're criticizing God. You're saying, you know, it's like
he just has a regular
it's like
old name.
it's like walking into a Krishna temple and saying the deity up there is just a bit of marble stone, just like any other statue. This was the critic
literally
position.
saying that Krishna's name, Krishna, is just any other name.
Yeah, yeah. So the position of the Slavi, the name glorifiers, is very similar to Vaishnavism. And even so, there was this book written by Alder Hilarion called On the Caucasus Mountains, I think was the name. And in it, he says things like, you can't just chant the name of Jesus and have some quarrel with your brother. First, you need to make things right with your brother, and then you can get the benefit of your chanting. So it's like the 10 offenses kind of thing. There's a similar sorts of ideas. And I don't know how much it came from their tradition versus, I think a lot of it was from, well, Alder Hilarion studied intensively the tradition. He had access to a library in the golden age for Eastern Orthodox monks on Mount Athos. So he studied quite a bit, but also he was a real ascetic. He was a real recluse and really into his meditation. So I'm sure a lot of it came from his personal revelations from his meditations.
You want to submit to God in His ultimate power and bow down to His absolute authority. You're overwhelmed with a sense of submission that makes you want to dedicate yourself to that higher truth, that higher purpose in devotion to the Almighty. Again, these are emotions that can't exist in polytheism. There is no one central deity that
Why can't those feelings exist? Why? If it's power, if you're just being overwhelmed by power, so there's a more sophisticated way to examine the type of, the nuances of the flavor of the emotion that one might feel in relation to God. In the East, you'd look at this, this would be a discussion about rasa. And we would describe the rasa. So you have, well, what is it? 7 primary flavors of relationship. That would be starting at neutrality. Well, there's you can even go negative. You could say you have hatred. You could have hatred towards God. You can have, but the positive ones, you have neutrality. At neutrality is where one has come into contact, and you'll see this in many people's mystical religious experiences, is where you experience the oneness of being, and you experience that oneness, that all-pervading consciousness as God, and you being part of it, one with it, with complete non-difference. And this experience gives rise to this to peace. They call it shanta. It's peace, complete self-satisfaction, and awe. And this becomes the first platform. From this, the experience deepens, and once again, within the non-duality, there's a duality again, wherein one experiences God, that whole oneness as God, and you as a witness to that, and then you are witnessing the greatness and the grandness of God. You experiencing God as time and as space, as the universe itself, as all power, all pervasive, omniscient. And when you come in contact with that, when you have that experience of God, the feeling is what he's describing here. There's awe with fear, because it's overwhelming in its immensity. Arjuna has this experience in the Bhagavad Gita when he witnesses the the Kalapurusha, the universal form, right? The immensity of it, and the immensity of the reality of it, good and bad, right? If we were to acknowledge all time and all experience, we'd have to acknowledge all the good and all the bad and all of everything in between. And if you were to try to hold all of that within your awareness at once, it's overwhelming and terrifying. And so and it's completely humbling. And this is like within Hinduism, this is at Kalapurusha, this is time, this is you would have darshans of Shiva in this, or even Narayan. Seeing Vishnu has this amount of scope, and the feeling is then of dasyam. You feel small, and the desire to serve that supreme being, to you're still the desire is manifest in humility, and you naturally, in that darshan and that experience, you feel very small. Then if you were to continue the service, that relationship deepens, because there was a relationship that started at each level of these realizations. The relationship deepens, and not unlike even in the material, this world now, if you were to meet some tremendously famous person, tremendously powerful person, say like, somebody, let's think of someone who could be like a little on the scary side of powerful, right? You like Vladimir Putin walks in, and you're like, oh snap, this is Putin. Like, I heard there's a funny story of him meeting this football player, and he had a Super Bowl ring, from winning a Super Bowl, and Vladimir Putin asked, oh, can I see that? And so the player took it off and handed it to Putin, and then Putin just put it on and just walked away with his ring, right? Like, what would you do? Right. Vladimir Putin, right? And so if you had to be around that, you might be like, oh, okay, what am I doing here? What am I, right? And if you got to know him, the relationship might change, right? So then in the next rasa, next flavor of love is that of friendship, where you're interacting with God as your innermost friend, and he's dear to you. And in that, the grandness no longer matters. Just like here and now, if you were friends with, like, say Tom Cruise was your best friend, you went to school with Tom Cruise, and now he's one of the richest, most famous guys in the world, and I'm Joe Schmo. Maybe I mow lawns, I make 40 grand a year, I'm nobody, but we're friends. And when we're together, I'm not thinking that he's Tom Cruise, the great grand big movie star who can probably snap his fingers and make things happen. No, he's my buddy Tom Cruise, right? And I'm sure Tom Cruise has those kind of people in his life.
Hopefully.
So on a similar thing, that the devotee of the Lord, having developed nearness and dearness, where God has become so sacred within his heart, and God is so willing to interact with him, that a friendship develops, and then the relationship is that of a friend. And the majesty is not the important bit anymore. The fear is no longer important anymore. In fact, that would be an obstacle. And even in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna says to Krishna, I'm being overwhelmed by this vision that you're showing me. Please, let me see your two-armed form again. Right? And then you take another step, and that develops even further. We see that there's almost a parental affection, and you can see that in religious traditions. For example, even in Christianity, where you see the Virgin Mary worshiping the baby Jesus. These traditions where there's people who naturally have this almost parental affection to the baby Jesus. And then deeper than that, what you have in Islam is to worship the beloved, where God becomes the beloved. His majesty is not the be all and end all. His power, his grandness, his greatness, that's not the flavor that you're actually trying to relish. The flavor is intimacy and affection and nearness and dearness and love.
Let's try to make it to some of his arguments, so we don't need to respond to every little thing he's made. He's kind of repeating a lot of the same baseless claims.
Yeah.
has all power in polytheism. Rather, power is distributed among many gods, and many gods are so weak they can be
I guess one point to make on this quickly is like, what does he think? Does he think God's going to be there personally doing all this stuff? Like, should God
Well,
be the...
again, why did Michael the archangel again?
Yeah.
Why are there angels? What do they do? Does that mean that God does everything and angels don't do anything within the kingdom of God? But we know the angels do something because Michael the archangel went to Muhammad and taught Muhammad personally. That is their tradition. Why didn't God do that? Or did God do that through Michael the archangel?
Yeah. So we see it happening in their tradition, but also, like, what does he expect the alternative to be? Like, God's going to personally be there running all the weather and personally, like, there.
Well, it could be. I mean, that's essentially what he's saying. But what I would, and there would be no argument against that. You could say that God does that, and ultimately, even in Hinduism, you would acknowledge that God is doing that, even when He's doing it through whatever all his the apparent agents of His will. It's still His will, still His power that's being distributed, and essentially, it's still Him doing everything.
Yeah, so he gives them this power. These gods aren't weak. That I mean, you could say these gods are weak, but these gods are getting their power from God. They're not
From
gods.
God.
Again, it's a vocabulary problem. He's using the word
my
God.
My argument to the Muslims would be that in their tradition there is a hierarchy of beings who serve the kingdom of God, and they are doing things, and they even acknowledge them. I keep bringing up Michael, but there's the Kodams. There's all kinds of mystic traditions regarding the hierarchy of beings in Islam. They're there. They're doing stuff for God.
Sweet. Okay, let's keep going.
controlled through bribes and magic. God's so weak that people can even threaten them. You say to a deity, if you don't do this for me, I will destroy your temples. How can you have humility before such wimpy, weak gods? This polytheistic theology...
That's are you aware of any tradition that does that?
I mean, there's ancestor worshippers, and you find people in India who worship like some ghost living in a tree next to their house.
Yeah, but what tradition says that I'm going to destroy your temple if you don't do this, this, and this, and this? I don't know any tradition that does that.
I mean, you get Muslims going around destroying temples. At least
Yeah,
historically, that's happened. So I don't know what he's on about. It's like,
I have no idea.
I mean, probably Muslims have destroyed more temples than any other religious tradition has. So
I would think that's probably true.
And like, we don't need to
I don't
say
know. Christianity is probably up there. I don't know about that one.
okay, Christianity isn't in competition, and we don't need to say Christianity caused that to happen. We can say it's social factors.
People.
Yeah, we can say it's people doing that, but
That's tribalism.
he's talking about Islam as if it's a solution to these problems, but there's Muslims that are doing these things.
That's true too. Like there's spirit worship in Islam.
produces people who lack humility, lack self-restraint, people who feel free rein to indulge in every vice, unchecked by a healthy fear of divine wrath.
How is that in polytheism? So he's putting forward all this imagery that has to do with essentially probably more in, this is all probably more atheistic situations or nihilistic situations even than polytheism.
Well, also, I think the Islamic way of preventing people from doing things like that is violence, whereas in Eastern traditions, it's more this attitude of you can do what you want as long as you're not hurting someone, but we'll prevent you from doing things that aren't good for you by offering you a positive alternative.
In some cases, I would think that there's probably a certain amount of coercion that is universal, again, as a human condition for people who are not so equipped for dealing with other people. It's the easy out.
Well, yeah, I mean, we could forget about talking about this tradition versus that tradition and talk about like ideal universal principles of how you deal with these things. And that's kind of, if you're hurting someone else, you get punished. If you're just doing something that you could be doing something better, here's a positive alternative, but you can keep doing that lower thing if you want.
Yeah.
In this same vein, Judaism is a supposedly monotheistic religion, but it actually shares this aspect of polytheism. Monotheism, on the one hand, is a belief in one omnipotent God, but on the other hand, belief in one omnipotent God has consequences. If you truly believe that this one God has all power and knowledge, then this is a God that you fully submit to. It's not a God that you try to argue with, or try to challenge, or try to outsmart. But this is precisely what Judaism does. The way that Jews depict God, they celebrate the notion of debating with God, winning arguments against God, even triumphing over God. This comes from the traditional Jewish doctrine of the Torah is not in heaven, which means that rabbis have ultimate authority in determining religious laws, and even God himself cannot overrule them.
Do you know much about...
I don't know enough about Judaism to make any comments on that.
I'll
but
probably
I
just
suspect that he's...
skip this part unless he has a really bad argument.
Talmud story of the oven of Achnai, God himself states a legal position by miraculously speaking to a group of rabbis directly from heaven. But the rabbis disagree with God's position and argue that God is mistaken. By the end of the story, God admits, "My children have defeated me." In this way, in Judaism, the rabbis are ultimate lawmakers above even God. And this principle is allegedly acknowledged by God himself. According to the Talmud, God admits, "Even I must obey the decree of the rabbis." Such religion...
Well, I think we
Well, there's two parts to that. One is you could say that is a... the danger of that is it's a little bit like Brahmanism, where the Brahmanas have co-opted a social position and have made themselves disputable, right? So that would be the danger. That could have, if whether that's was always there, or was an interpolation that was added through time, or it's just something that can be abused. On the positive, it goes back to the Revelation, where the rabbi's own conscience is allowed to guide, and not just the letter of the law, but his own conscience and his own ability to assess the situation and to give guidance is justified. And that's an interesting proposition.
What that made me think of is when somebody is an advanced devotee, then God has the person is really dear to God, so God will honor that person's word in a way. Within reason,
it's just like it shows that this is going to the nuances of these relationships and how you have various traditions who are holding various kinds of relationships with God as most high. For example, in our tradition, the gopis, or the Vraja gopis, who are the most you could say what would be the word that I'm looking for? To give Krishna the most pushback, who are the most, in one sense, uncooperative. They offer everything to him, including their disapproval. They don't hold anything back. They're the highest. They're considered the highest when love is the ultimate conclusion. And so they offer everything, including their anger or their dissatisfaction or whatever it might be. Like we're in the month of Kartik, and this month we worship Krishna with the Damodarastika, where we're worshiping the moment where Krishna as a child is being chased by his mother, who's angry with him, and she's running after him with a stick to smack him on his butt, right? A Muslim would, someone who has this this the dominant flavor of his is this complete awe and submission to the majesty of God, will look at that and think that's absolutely a crime. How can you chase after God and try to hit him with a stick? Not understanding the nuances of the love that's being exchanged between the two. So this is a matter of flavor. This is an issue of flavor.
Yeah.
And even amongst the, if we go to our tradition, we talk about the two groups of gopis that are lovers of Krishna, and those two groups of gopis, they don't see Krishna the same way. They can't understand the other. How could you treat Krishna like this? How can you interact with Krishna like this? How could you say that about Krishna? How could you do that about Krishna? So this is a difference of human nature.
All right, let's keep going.
That insult their gods by subordinating them to humans do nothing but breed followers who are arrogant, defiant, and rebellious. This is, again, the complete opposite of monotheism.
I think that's a sociological question. Is it actually the case that there's more defiance among Jews?
Yeah, I mean, is a Orthodox Jew more defiant and more towards God, rebellious towards God than a devout Muslim? I don't know that I would be able to make that.
I very much doubt that.
Hmm.
And also, I mean, in Islamic places where the incentive to follow is you'll be punished with death or some other horrendous punishment, I don't know that, that it's a little bit too much sticks and carrots and not enough intrinsic motivation, because really what we're trying to bring about is a transformation in consciousness where you're loving God because you love God, not because there's some sticks and carrots that are chasing you and incentivizing you to get there.
In that regard, I think that we'd have to leave room for, I've known Muslim women who wear hijab not because of fear of punishment, but because of a genuine pride, you could even say, in the act of that as a means of, that's part of their worship, that's part of who they are, and they do that not out of fear. So yeah, I think that the fear, the carrots and the stick is present in all religious traditions. Almost all religious traditions have some concept of hell.
Oh, you need some amount of it, but too much of it is problematic.
Definitely. So I'm being, I guess I'm being, I am being supportive I'm pushing back a little bit against the characterization of Islam as that being the primary motivating factor in how they are approaching God. I don't know that is true.
But well, they have high degrees of it compared to other religions. So if you did find that Muslims were less defiant, it could just be because of the carrot and stick scenario.
True. I mean, the reality is that genuine love of God is rare.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Even among Hare Krishnas.
Whether that motivation is for, the delights of heaven or the respite of not suffering or whatever it might be, genuine, unmotivated, pure love of God or anything or anyone is rare.
Beyond fear, love, and gratitude, monotheism produces rock-solid certainty. This is because the notion of a monotheistic God draws upon deep human intuitions we discussed in episode 2. All children intuitively recognize that the universe has a creator who controls the universe. These innate intuitions very much resonate with monotheism, but clash with polytheism. As psychologists acknowledge, this makes monotheism more intuitively compelling to the human mind. These intuitions are also used to rationally justify belief in one God. This is why you have many philosophical proofs for God, but you won't find any proofs about the existence of Hanuman, the monkey god, or Zulu, the moon goddess. Polytheistic gods are not only...
Sorry?
The moon itself is enough to make you go, well, there could be a moon goddess.
Yeah,
that would be Like I think his argument is like I don't know that that an argument for polytheism or monotheism is more innately intuitive. I think that's a statement that's based on his own cultural upbringing personally.
Yeah, Rupert Sheldrake wrote a paper called "Is the Sun Conscious," where he explores that topic. He's got a lecture on YouTube on it too.
Yeah,
It's
so
like it's an interesting question for sure. I mean, I don't know if you could say we have
if he, and plus for again, like if he wants to ask the question of whether or not Hanuman is real, he'd have to actually ask the question of who is Hanuman within the context of the religion that he's from. Who is Hanuman? And then the answer he's going to end up arriving at is related to the breath, and everybody breathes. And so it's not so, very simplistic thought.
I mean, he's engaging in straw man arguments left, right, and center. But that aside, we need to look at what if we do arrive at the conclusion that a perfect being exists at the foundation of reality, and then the question is what follows from that. So,
well, especially since that we're beings, and we're seeing beings all around us, right? So we can accept that there's a original point, and then you can accept that at this point there's all kinds of stuff. So in between, what's in between? And is acknowledging anything in between fundamentally bad?
Where I was going with the point about what follows from God existing is like the atheist wants to say, oh, you've got all this fantastic stuff in your supernatural worldview. We've just got matter. But the problem there is that if you want to say physics is all that exists, then what you're really claiming is there's inconceivable potency contained in matter. So basically, there's a mystery at every single atom. Everywhere you look, if you want to have a reductionist point of view, there's a little miracle which you can't explain, some kind of mystery going on. Whereas if you accept the existence of God, of a perfect being, full of potencies, just from that one mystery, you can explain everything else. But the argument I'm interested in having this discussion with Muslims and Christians some more. I haven't found a Muslim that's interested in having it. Often they'll say they don't know its tradition well enough. But the basic argument, you've probably heard it from Sridhar Goswami, is God is that being than which no greater can be imagined. So I can't imagine a greater being than the descriptions I've heard of Krishna, where he's got these personal relationships. He forgets that he's God, which enables him to have perfect loving relationships. He's not thinking, that we can imagine a parent-child relationship where the parent thinks he's better than the kids. That's not what happens. The parent doesn't think, there might be a sense of equals. It's just a relationship. It's not that like I'm the parent and you're just lucky I'm looking after you kind of thing. So God forgetting that he's God means the relationship can be more greater and deeper. So, and then having a servant like Hanuman as a servant of God makes God greater. A God who has these kind of loving servants it makes him greater. I can't imagine a way God could be greater by not having Hanuman as a servant.
Yeah, 100%.
Let's carry on.
Unintuitive, they're actually repulsive. For example, according to ancient Egyptian religion, their pantheon of gods was created when the head god Atum masturbated other gods out from his peak. Polytheistic myths are chock full of nasty, bizarre, or confusing things like this, which destroys people's certainty in gods.
Again, this is like beauty in the eye of the beholder. Like if we didn't grow up in the Middle East and very accustomed to Islam, we might be shocked by various parts of their cultural expressions, religious and otherwise. So I think this is a matter of personal taste.
All right. But not when you've got music like that. The music tells you it's bad. It's got to be bad with that kind of music.
Oh, of course.
I should get music like that for my videos, eh?
Christianity, for example. The issue with Christianity is they have formulated this Trinitarian conception of God, which is confusing at best. To make matters worse, the Bible teaches conflicting notions of God. One notion of God depicted in the Old Testament commands believers to kill women and children and commit genocide.
How is that different than... How is that, well, different than jihad?
Yeah, he doesn't comment on Islam at all in this video, other than saying that it's all hunky-dory.
And then again, the attack on the Trinity as just they don't have non-duality as a conceptual basis that they play with. So in Christianity, they have non-duality at the point of the Trinity.
Right.
But in the New Testament, God in the form of Jesus tells believers to turn the other cheek. In the Old Testament, God commands believers to stone the adulterer.
Yeah, this is another bit where I'm like, that's a bit rich coming from a Muslim.
Yep.
I mean, we don't need to get into digging through.
I mean, I guess what he's is his argument that somehow or other it should have been consistent, the Old Testament. So if it was in the Old Testament about stoning, then Jesus should have said, we should stone them. That's basically what he's arguing.
The argument might be, if you look at the New Testament, it all looks great. But if you look at the Old Testament,
it's inconsistent.
Oh, what? So the Quran's all right because it's consistent. And
yeah, that's what he's saying. That's actually what he's saying.
I don't know. Yeah.
If you go back and see what he said, he said that it's full of inconsistencies and.
Okay.
That gives
all right. Yeah, I didn't catch that bit. All right. So at least the Quran is consistent in its.
Yeah, in the Old Testament you stone them, and in the New Testament you should stone them.
Then the Bible would be fine. Okay. All right.
But in the New Testament, God in the form of Jesus says that only he without sin should cast stones. It's like the Christian God can't make up his mind.
See?
This conflicted notion.
You don't have sound for some reason.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I muted myself because I had a cough. But the Muslim God is consistent in his bigotry, so he's all right.
Of God only breeds confusion and doubt. This is the main reason.
That's a weird thing to say because, I mean, there's millions and millions of Christians all over the world who aren't confused and full of doubt.
Yeah.
So if it breeds confusion and doubt, where are all the confused and doubting Christians?
That's the case.
I mean, obviously there's lots of Christians who are confused and doubting, but I don't think that you can blame it on this particular point he's making here. And I don't know if there's a higher rate of them than there are.
I think that you could make an argument. I've known Christians who don't like reading the Old Testament; they prefer the New Testament. I could see how that inconsistency in tone would be confusing. How do you make moral choices? You have some people who are going to lead to the orthodoxy, and they'll be like, "See, here in the Old Testament it says stone them," and then there'll be another kind of Christian that will say, "Well, yeah, but that doesn't follow Jesus's example." So I could see how that inconsistency could give rise to various either offshoot traditions or, but is that in itself? I don't know that you don't have that in Islam.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's a good parody of that argument, or the parallel, taking that same logic to make a parallel argument that the instructions of how to make a particular type of engine, which is more efficient, they're confusing because it's a more intricate process. So better to make these engines they were making 100 years ago because the instructions are simpler. You're going to get less confused.
Yeah.
Because I mean,
also give room for any nuance. You have to whitewash it out and make it one plate. I don't necessarily know that reality and functioning reality is 100% in the highest in the highest resolution that it's always seemingly consistent. I don't know that it is.
Yeah, I mean, I always let people speak for their own tradition. So, we can assume Christian apologists have satisfactory answers for these.
Yeah.
And those answers might remove all the doubts if you just take the time to listen to them.
And the same would be said about Islam, because if they got attacked for being, they were characterized as violent, and you cherry picked verses from the Quran, you could paint them as being violent and bloodthirsty, bigoted, intolerant, and cruel, chauvinistic, so on and so forth. You could paint that picture cherry picking verses from the Quran. Those verses are there. And there would be Muslims certainly who would put forth arguments and show another side of Islam. So then we would say we would basically be in the same situation, that it's inconsistent. Or is it? And that would be the argument. It's like, is it inconsistent? I don't know that it is, or I don't know that it isn't. But you'd have a very similar, I would suspect.
Yeah, I suspect you could dig through the Quran and the Hadith and find inconsistencies and lodge a similar argument back at them. And we can just say the same thing back. I'm sure a Muslim apologist can have satisfactory answers, and sincere Muslims can find God by listening to the right preachers.
Yeah.
Why Christian societies have fallen into apostasy and secularization time and time again. Lest we forget, Christianity is the only religion that was so thoroughly stomped by its own apostates that it birthed secularism and modern atheism. It's no coincidence.
I don't know if he's accurately portraying the history of that, but we can just leave it for others to comment on that, perhaps.
It's an interesting, I think it's an interesting idea. I'll give him that.
Coincidence that secularists tell Muslims that they should follow Christians. They say Islam needs to have a reformation like Christianity. But Christianity had a reformation because they have this very confusing notion of God that clashes with monotheistic intuitions. But it's the strong monotheism of Islam that creates certainty in Muslims and makes them reject secular efforts at reforming and liberalizing their...
I don't think that's why Muslims are so opposed to modern liberal values. I think what it is they grow up in big families and they have a really deep culture.
Yeah.
And that culture is they carry it with them because of their large families. They've got big communities, and that just makes
history.
And history, yeah, and that just means they carry that culture deeply. And if Christians had bigger families and carried their culture deeper,
I think that faith is fairly universal. Be that you'll have atheists with strong conviction, with certainty even. And you'll have Christians who feel a certain degree of certainty. You'll have Hindus that have certainty. That you're not in most of these, like especially on the ideological level, they are going to feel certain. It's existential. It's part of you can even say ego structure. For someone to feel comfortable, there's a certain certainty that they are operating with in the world. That at least on a functional level, they function with certainties. Like, even I'm certain that tomorrow I'm going to be able to go to work. Where in reality, I don't actually know. There's all kinds of things could go wrong. So there's even on these certainties are functional, and everybody's running them. And you'll have ideological certainties that at various points in time may change. But generally speaking, from the day to day, you're running on certain kind of certainties, and a lot of them have some element of faith. So that argument, I'm like, what are you talking about?
Religion. What also makes secularists rage is how Muslims have been so resistant to the colonial project. Colonizers have had great difficulty getting Muslims to sell out and abandon the monotheism that is the linchpin of Muslim life. Polytheism, on the other hand, well, let's just say it's relatively easier to get people to stop believing in Brahma, the god who raped his own daughter, or Atum, the masturbating god. In a short amount of time, colonialism wiped out, assimilated, or reformed thousands of polytheistic religions throughout the world, but the unshakable faith of Muslims has been the thorn in the side of European colonial powers for over 200 years.
Such a weird argument.
Yeah.
He's just put forward imagery of these cultures being annihilated, where they faced either change and drop their religious, they were forced to give up their religious beliefs or face annihilation, mostly by Abrahamic religions, either economic annihilation, literal annihilation.
Yeah, I think it's
and Islam was a part of the spear in which that did that.
I think it's like he's arguing that because Islamic culture, what really explains that is Islamic culture has had military and empire success. And of course, when you do that, you're going to keep your own religion too. So because they've had military and empire success, maybe those two things are the same, therefore the religion's better. But I don't think that follows. I think you can have a successful civilization and have wrong religious beliefs.
Is it saying, like, what if those other traditions were more open-minded? They might have been more open-minded. They might have been more peaceful, which didn't favor them. They might have been more gentle, more open to negotiation, more accommodating, all kinds of qualities that maybe came from beautiful religious principles that didn't allow them to go and annihilate other cultures. And somehow that's being presented as a superior.
Yeah, I mean, another thing we could say is, so he's talking about religions as if they're like Islam is its own thing, and you only find Islam in Islam, and Christianity is its own thing, you only find Christianity in Christianity, and so on. So if it's given up, it's gone. That's it. You've given up something, you should have kept it. But I think the real way we should look at it is in various world religions, we find bhakti. We also find various other philosophies to varying degrees. And so, even if one of these religions is assimilated into another one, we still find bhakti, we still find various other varieties of religious practice and principles.
Indeed. There's no monopoly.
Monotheism produces this beautiful psychology grounded in love, gratitude, humility, and certainty.
After he just showed them annihilating the other people, right?
Right.
Whoa. And that psychology creates societies that are more honest, more altruistic, more harmonious.
All things you find in many world religions.
Did we see that from all these monotheistic cultures?
Yeah, again, it's my line. This is a bit rich coming from a Muslim.
Yes. These are facts cited in recent academic books like Big Gods by Professor Ara Norenzian. There are several reasons for this. First of all, monotheists are much more motivated to be moral because they fear God. If you believe God...
You can do that just with karma. There's many things you can.
Well, even going back to the the beginning of his in one of the early critiques was polytheistic traditions that worshipped various deities out of fear to try to appease them. So I don't see a difference.
Yeah, I mean, that brings up one other point that I wanted to make, which is, like, if there's one thing we can say with a great degree of certainty does create problems, and that is if you believe God is in some way or other evil. So, that old line, if you convince people to believe absurdities, then they will commit atrocities. So if you truly believe that preacher of that other religion is taking people to hell in a handbasket, and they're going to suffer for eternity, the most horrendous suffering imaginable, then you can justify killing that preacher. And the logic is internally consistent. But if you believe God is actually a loving person, actually cares, then you would never believe that God would punish people in that way. and therefore you can never justify religious violence.
Nor would you believe that God only gave knowledge to a small group of people in one isolated area of the world.
Yeah, so that too. That's another thing. Yeah, I'd make a lot of videos on that subject, and yeah, the logic makes no sense to me. That I've dealt with it with Christians a lot, and they'll say things like, "Well, God's given I can't remember what they call it, but there's like an internal light, so you can sort of like, even though there's no tradition in some parts of the world, still you can find God in your heart."
At best, he's very unfair in that means, because he creates every single person according to their tradition imperfectly, and then he gives them all. He doesn't give them the same playing ground. They're not on the same playing field. They don't get the same start. Why? So at best, he's very unfair.
Well, then they resort to Molinism. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Molinism is the idea that God knew the different choices we would make if he placed us in different situations. So he created, he did a bunch of trade-offs and created an optimal world based on the conditions he was working with, because he can't force us to make certain decisions, but he can create a world where some of us, where the largest number of souls are likely to choose God. So he's
well, then, but then you would still,
decisions.
if you were to accept that, which I could accept that, then you would have to accept that where they're at is actually good for them.
Yeah, I mean, God creates a world knowing some souls won't be liberated, won't choose him in that world, and maybe if he created a different world, that soul would have chosen him, but he's had to make a trade-off, because he's created a world where the largest number of souls will choose him. It's a weird answer, and it's basically something you would only dream up to plug a hole in a theology.
Yeah.
You know how philosophers come up with weird answers?
No means in that conception for absolute success.
Well, yeah.
It means on some level he's a failure, which is an interesting...
It's not universalism. Yeah, it's a kind of the alternative term that people give is infernalism. That you need another shorthand, but I think there's a less loaded term that some people have used to refer to the alternative view.
Yeah. Anyhow,
God Almighty can zap you with lightning at any moment. That's going to keep you honest in your daily life. But you don't find this kind of fear in polytheism, as we already mentioned.
But again, he's being inconsistent, because he already talked about traditions that worship out of fear.
Yeah, I mean, he criticized traditions for worshiping out of fear, and then he talks about how worshiping out of fear is good because it stops you from acting sinfully.
The other traditions don't have this fear.
I mean, we can agree that worshiping out of fear is good, but the next best thing is to worship out of love, because fearing God is better than nothing, but better than fearing God is loving God. And if you love God, you will do the right thing out of love, not out of fear. But again, he's just ignoring the diversity of how you find people all over the spectrum and basically all of the traditions.
Yeah.
Secondly, in monotheism, God is all-knowing, but polytheistic gods are not. Polytheistic gods are sometimes so ignorant they can be tricked. For example, in Greek religion, Zeus was tricked by Prometheus. In Hinduism, the god...
So that's all true, and we can agree with those criticisms, but we don't hold to a worldview like that. He's just ignoring the fact that we agree with him on some of these points.
Or even in our own, we would have a more nuanced, which is that there's a level of God that is all-knowing, and that is all-knowing all the time. Then there's also God who engages in the play of life.
Yeah, but you can't trick God like Lord Brahma. Like you can't trick God like Lord Brahma stealing the cows and the cowherd boys. It's still an all-powerful God.
I would argue that there are times where Krishna allows himself to be tricked.
Oh yeah, but then it's part of a loving relationship, and that's
exactly. So what I'm saying in the play of the whole Yogamaya in our tradition is the willingness to serve the Leela, where Krishna will forget to the degree that he wants to be. He humanizes himself in a sense,
Yeah,
and
but
he plays the most rich. He goes for the most rich experience of reality. The whole reality is a rich experience, and there's parts of himself that stay in full omniscient mode, and there's parts of him who don't have to. So, like here he could. I'm not sure which Leela of Lord Shiva he's gonna bring up, but you could think of. I can think of the story of is it Dantavakra? No, who's the one where Lord Shiva gives him the benediction to that anyone he touches on the head, the head will explode, and then that person wants to touch Lord Shiva's head.
I can't remember the name, but yeah, I know the one you mean.
Right?
Yeah, and then Vishnu had to come and save him.
Now, Lord Shiva essentially is, within the context of Hinduism, is God. Even you can go to Srimad Bhagavatam, he's Ishwar, he's God. So he's being tricked. And that's leaving room for essentially for free will, and that everything isn't exactly, it's not all completely set in stone.
Right.
And I don't know that you can have free will and not have the capacity for something that can be new. Even Krishna, it's ever fresh. So the reality is ever fresh and new and exciting, because somehow or other, Krishna himself is inexplicable and surprises himself.
Let's see which one he plays.
God Shiva ignorantly decapitated his own son because his wife Parvati had a child without him knowing. That's the level of ignorance of these gods.
He didn't ignorantly decapitate him. He very consciously decapitated him.
Right.
If a polytheist cheats, steals, lies, murders, and rapes, he won't have to worry about divine retribution because the gods probably won't even know about it. This connection between increased dishonesty and polytheism has actually been experimentally proven in numerous studies. Thirdly, polytheistic societies are more immoral because they worship gods who are themselves highly immoral. The idea that God is all good and is the source of morality is actually a monotheistic concept.
How does he make that claim? There's morality in every single one of these religious traditions.
I mean, do Muslims, by and large, really follow higher moral principles than other monotheists? I mean, he's calling all these other religions polytheists, but you find many of them are actually monotheistic.
I think what you're going to find is that in every religious tradition, there's going to be a moral framework in which they work. And then people can have an argument about who's more moral and who's less moral, I suppose, which is, I guess, again, part of the human condition.
Yeah, right.
In Greek polytheism, Zeus is depicted as seducing and raping other gods and other people. In Hinduism, gods like Indra, Krishna, and many others are depicted as serial rapists. The Hindu text Bhavishya Purana describes how the gods Vishnu, Shiva, and Brahma work together to gang rape Anusuya, a Hindu sage's wife.
There's a lot of that rape being thrown around.
It's not.
I don't know the Leela in question.
He doesn't quote any verses, does he?
No, I don't know the Leela that he's referring to, so I can't comment.
My inclination is to skip that part, but then people will probably criticize us for not reacting to one of his arguments.
I don't know how he calls Krishna a serial rapist.
Do you want to look into that and come back and we can add a comment later?
At the best, he could be criticized for Yeah, we can come back to that if you like.
The Hindu god Kali is often depicted holding a severed head, wearing a necklace of decapitated heads and dead baby fetus earrings. One Hindu sect, the Aghoris, even to this day give sexual satisfaction to goddess Kali by having intercourse with rotten human corpses.
That's not true. Well, that's a characterization. Certainly, I don't need to. Aghoris are the more shocking group of. I mean, as shocking as it gets within the Hindu culture, certainly.
So a fair comparison would be for us to take the most shocking sect of Islam and talk about them.
They would probably say that the most shocking group of Islam still looks better in their eyes than the most shocking group in Hinduism, being the Aghoris, but they wouldn't look at what's actually going on for an Aghori or an Aghori practice. And it's not giving sexual satisfaction to Mother Kali. I can tell you that for straight.
Right. I mean, I think it's hard to get worse than going around murdering people because you disagree with their religious beliefs. You know,
I suppose. I mean,
killing
you're
people.
You're going necrophiliac versus killing people. I'd still say the necrophiliac is at least no one was harmed, right?
Yeah, I think the murdering people is worse, and we don't need to say Islam causes that, but there's plenty of Muslims who go around and do a lot of violence. So, yeah.
What kind of society is created when people worship gods who not only lie and cheat, but are also serial rapists and bloodthirsty killers of babies?
Okay, so he's talking about how there's a lot of children who are sexually abused in India, or girls who are sexually abused in India. And that's definitely true. But I don't think it's got anything to do with the religious beliefs.
It is definitely worth asking why that is there. The interesting thing would be to also ask the question about how Islam is implicated in that, because Islam is implicated in the culture and the culture diversity of India.
That's true, yeah.
Whether that's a Hindu issue or whether that's an India issue, and if it's an India issue, to what extent is Islam part of that corruption?
Yeah, I mean, is that the case?
That there's, I don't know, like if you go to Pakistan or you go to, are less girls being raped? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But you go there, you'll find issues with little, sexual assaults on little boys.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm definitely not going to be able to monetize this video.
Sorry.
I mean, it's the video reacting to that talks about it.
Yeah, but I mean, the argument is still valid. His argument is valid that what is it about India and India's culture? Is it their philosophy? Is it
I don't know if it's India more than other third world countries. Like the exception to this kind of thing is Western developed countries that have a modern judicial system and policing system and Western culture. That's where you find the lowest rates of that kind of crime. And I think there's many factors you could boil it down to. Part of it's cultural, and part of it's judicial. Like in India, it's basically a third world country. They don't have a very thorough policing and criminal justice system. It's understaffed, underdeveloped, and they can't keep up with the amount of people and crime.
Yes. But having lived in India, having spent time in India, I love India, but it wouldn't be a place that I would comfortably let my daughter travel alone.
Yeah.
Whereas I know people who, I haven't been to Mexico myself, but I know many people who do. Or what's another, and I don't know that it would be the same kind of danger.
Yeah.
Third world countries in general are dangerous. more dangerous than second or first world. That's a given. But I could see arguments in the attack on Indian culture, at least modern Indian culture, and how it deals with women at times. And I don't know that it's that different to Islam. And you see, like, look at Islamic culture and rape in countries like Sweden, where there's a huge Islamic migration, and what that did to the rape statistics. Is it, like all of a sudden we're oh, really? You guys are the moral ones. But it's what I don't, I suppose for myself, want to do is start doing this like we're throwing stones back and forth. I think there has to be a universal acknowledgement of the human condition, and that religion in of itself doesn't absolve you from the human condition.
Well, I mean, and coming back to the universal principles thing and making it not sectarian, we're gonna, we can say in the cases of the Muslims who are doing those things, they're not following Islam properly. I'm cool with that. We can say the same thing in India. Those Indians who are committing these crimes or permitting them, they're not following the Vedas.
They're not sanctioned.
And today in India, like, many people, including Hare Krishnas, many serious practitioners of Indian traditions will say of modern India that it's degraded. It's not following the spiritual wisdom traditions.
In some places, right?
And to the extent that it's not following it, that's to the extent to which you find this crime widespread. And
there's various kinds of corruptions within their traditions, and there's various, like, it is an issue that you have the and not at the same time that you have the bringing together of these two, what seem like, from this video, fairly diametrically opposed kind of cultural contexts of Islam and Hinduism, and they've been cohabiting India for 700 years or so.
I mean, another question is, 800 years ago in India, what were these crime rates like?
And how many of those rapes are Muslims versus Hindus?
Yeah.
Is there a...
Yeah, all right, let's keep going.
What kind of society is created when rituals involve necrophilia, cannibalism, bestiality, and child torture? In fact, studies show that in countries like India, for example, a large percentage of the Hindu population justifies crimes like rape and child sacrifice by appealing to these gods.
Women in classical Hindu imagination. What is it? The characterization of women and of women's nature and rape tolerant attitudes. I don't know where this poll is coming from or who was polled.
Countries like India, for example, a large...
There, he gives the details here.
...in child torture. In fact, studies show that...
Journal of Religion and Violence, Volume 2, 2014. Anyway, let's carry on.
That in countries like India, for example, a large percentage of the Hindu population justifies crimes like rape and child sacrifice by appealing to these gods.
He doesn't show the actual question, he's just showed the graph.
Nor does he... But again, if we were
the
to
characterization
of
of
Islam, and it's an odd...
Here he's got the characterization of woman and or woman's nature in sacred scripture contributes to rape tolerant attitudes. It's how much victim blaming, maybe? Anyway.
But also in this thing, only it's 38% are in the agree or strongly agree. Only 5 is in the strong. I bet you they could find 5% of their population that might agree with the extreme of their religious views.
Yeah, I'm sure you could find questions that you could poll Muslims on and get answers that a lot of people would be morally shocked by.
And the characterization of women and of women's nature in sacred scriptures contribute to rape-tolerant attitudes. So, okay. It might be a very valid criticism.
Now,
yeah, but then we'll just want to say they're not following the Vedas properly. They need to read Bhagavad Gita and Bhagavatam where the Vedas are criticized. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, and rape is akin to murder in Vedas. So I the idea that,
yeah,
it's, yeah.
Contrast with Muslim societies. Because Islam has Tawheed as the strong, uncompromising monotheism, Muslim societies have less fornication, less infidelity, they drink less, get addicted to drugs less, commit homicide less, commit suicide less. And
do they really
Are they
commit
the
homicide
largest
less?
consumers of pornography?
I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of these stats he's giving. Like, Muslims in Canada are basically the only people who will do anything. Like, there's this thing called honor killing. You'll only ever find Muslims doing it. And we don't need to go into the details of it, but it's horrific.
Yeah.
Generally avoid other immoral behaviors to a greater extent than both polytheist and secular societies. But the beauty of Islamic monotheism doesn't end there. Because monotheism creates deep conviction, this results in strong religious identity. Rather than religious identity, polytheistic societies have strong ethno-nationalist identities. This is because they don't have religious beliefs that are strong or compelling enough to rally around. Since they can't depend on their beliefs, polytheists have to depend on other things like shared blood or culture.
I mean, we're a testament to that doesn't work. We're white Hindus.
Yeah.
That have, I mean, I have no national identity, practically speaking. I mean, I think that certainly, you know, you'll have countries that rally behind a religious identity. I think that's a very strange argument he's making, that his identity as a Muslim is any different than a Kali worshipper's identity as a Kali Bhakta or a...
Yeah, I mean, the principle he's talking about is true. You give up religion, and then you have new religions cropping up, and the new religions don't seem to be any better than...
You're going to have an identity part, some part of that your experience is going to fill that void. Well, and you're going to project that identity of your belief system on something.
Well,
but everybody has a belief system that they identify with.
Yeah, well, with the rise of secularism, where people have given up, you know, Christianity largely because we're talking about the Western world, then we've had the rise of wokeism, which is basically just another religion.
Yeah, it's another ideology.
But in Islam, Tawheed unites people regardless of ethnicity, race, or culture. This is why Islam is this revolutionary
for any ideology that's shared. Be it wokeism, or you know, you can have a shared identity in a football club. Everybody comes together on a Sunday or whatever it is, the day that people play football, and they have this shared identity and chant their chants, and
keeps people out of trouble too.
And like, keeps them out of trouble. Like,
I've got two young boys. I want them to get into sports.
Shared identity is powerful, and can be really good and really bad. You could argue for the negatives of that on many levels.
Oh yeah, I mean that's how a lot of the jihad stuff is done.
As the history of Islam shows, it brought together all the Arab tribes and from day one integrated many other races into one Muslim ummah.
That was a really whitewashed way to do that. From day one, we just integrated them into our society.
Right, yeah. But really it was military conquest.
Islamic monotheism is strong enough to unite the masses despite racial and ethnic differences. This is why Islam...
Is that the case, or did they just get their swords out?
Well, I mean, even if they got their swords out, on some level, there's a truth to what he's saying, that there are various kinds of ethnicities that have adopted Islam and have rallied behind that rather than holding on to their ethnicity as the dominant factor. I suppose you could make the argument. But certainly that strength that he's describing has to include the violence, the threat of violence.
So the best we can say is it's a bit of both. There's what's called soft power, where like today in Thailand you can see remnants of Vedic culture, and Thailand was
Yeah.
never conquered. That it was
Yeah.
soft power. They just saw, and Western civilization, and let's say the last 30 years, Western culture has spread because of soft power. People just think it's a
Yeah.
nicer culture and they want to adopt it,
Yeah.
not because of the sword or the gun or anything. Although I guess there's still some of that going on with America, going around bringing democracy to people.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Islam has been the most racially diverse religion from the beginning.
I mean, at least in the early days of the Hare Krishna movement, it would have been the most racially diverse. You go to a Krishna temple and you'd see people from all, basically the
Well, I
local
think
population
you
was
could also say
represented.
that Christianity is incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
I would
So it's a
argue
weird
probably
argument.
more so than Islam.
It's a weird argument again.
It's a very strange argument.
What's so incredibly dishonest about other religions when they criticize Islam is they say, sure, Muslims have strong religious identity, but that makes them engage in religious discrimination, unlike our peaceful religions. Yes, Islam treats people differently according to their religion, guilty as charged. But it's not like discrimination doesn't exist in polytheistic or secular.
He just glossed over that as if it's nothing, eh?
Well, he's using essentially the argument that we've been pointing at him the whole time, which is that this is universal and that this is a human condition.
Oh, right. So, yeah, we're doing that,
So
but everyone else is doing it
all the way
too.
through and being consistent with his argument that, oh, well, look, we have this. We also are guilty of this. You're guilty of this. We're guilty of this. But instead of being consistent all the way through on some level, go, yeah, we do, you do, we do, you do, we do, you do, we do, which is probably more true universally across the board. You could probably go from the beginning to the end, and there's a you do, we do, you do, we do, you do.
The whole way through, yeah.
He did it at the end because he had to, because he can't. Well, what can you say?
Right.
It's indefensible, so he tried to own it. But it's a very funny position to take at that point in this thing. But still, we're the best. We're still the best.
Yeah, I mean, what you'd want to see is, yeah, we treat people differently based on their religion, but there's a very good reason why we do that. Here's why we do it. Here's the benefit from us doing that, and here's what would happen if we did things differently. And I don't see how you could make an argument for that because, I mean, basically, I think religion should be a soft power thing. Like, here's the positive alternative, and if you're not interested, that's fine. Here's the benefits that you can get from following it. Here's other people who benefit in this way. If you're interested in these benefits, we can sort you out. And if you're not, you can try those people over there and see if they've got something you want, and go nuts. Right? That's what it should be. And like an open marketplace of ideas.
Follow your heart, your conscience towards God, and in a way that inspires you and moves you in a positive direction. And you're allowed to follow your conscience, follow your inner guidance system, and take that and own that and glorify God, and it'll benefit your life. And there's no monopoly on what that's supposed to look like for you. We don't own it. You don't own it. Nobody owns it. And that's the truth.
But this attitude we're describing now is a luxury we have as a result of holding an understanding of God which is consistent with God being all-loving. If we had
universal,
an understanding of God which had certain inconsistencies with God being all-loving, such as, if you're not a member of my church, you're going to burn in eternal hellfire forever, then we wouldn't have that luxury, and we'd have to say, actually, I'm going to have to coerce you into following my religion so that you don't go to hell, because I can't afford to wait for a future birth when you might make the right choice because the stakes are too high. Whereas we can say, yeah, I mean, if you waste this life, being an alcoholic or whatever, you'll have another chance in your next lifetime, and
we would
you're going to
argue
suffer.
that it's not a waste. That I would make the argument that there's no such thing as a waste, because all experience is educational, and that it's all part of the evolution that's taking place for the spirit soul. There's no such thing as a waste. It might look like it, but even going backwards is going forward. That's ultimately the conclusion that our religious framework will make. That even seemingly going backwards is actually, you're still moving forward, because it's part of the evolution that takes place. And so there isn't such a thing. There is never a waste. It's never a waste. And it's always in service to you as the individual and to God as the whole.
So, I mean, there's definitely truth to that, but there's also a level on which I can make better and worse choices right here and now, and some of my choices in the past may have been better or worse.
Sure.
So
in the relative, you could say that's true. In the absolute, you'll find that it's all good.
Well, I mean, if I have a certain consciousness which causes me to make a choice which makes my journey back to God longer, I'm going to suffer a bit more. But that suffering is what I need in order to have the transformations of consciousness which bring me to the place I need to be to actually be purified enough to be with God. But it would be better if I were just a little bit more advanced in my level of consciousness right now.
Yeah, that you could say that. But the step backwards still for you at where you were at still was a step going forward, because that was what you needed. So it works. Both things end up being true. You end up on the relative, it's being true, yep, that there's this gradation of good and bad and better and worse and so on and so forth. And in the ultimate, you'll find it works out. It's all good.
So just to summarize, he's not going to give his explanation of why they discriminate against other religions, because basically the explanation is
he's doing a very
God's evil and he's going to punish members of other religions.
Societies. They all have boatloads of discrimination, but instead of religious discrimination, it's on the basis of race, ethnicity, or national origin. How is this supposedly better?
At least with Islam, religion represents a person's deepest beliefs, and it's something freely chosen.
But you can't choose your race.
All right, so we're discriminating against people for something where they made a choice we disagree with, and that's okay. It's not something immutable, so we can justify our discrimination.
I mean, I could see the argument, and even a certain, like, could you accept that religious bigotry is better than racist bigotry? That's essentially sort of the argument that he's making.
Yeah, race is immutable. You're born that way. There's nothing you can do about it. Religion you can change.
Yeah. So would it be better to be a religious bigot over a racist?
I don't think so, because people's religious beliefs, it's something they sincerely have pursued. Like, if like, let's say, give an example of political opinions. If I study the subjects and come to, and with my, and I'm a good moral person, I actually care, and I just come to a different conclusion about a particular issue of what's best for society. And then you come along and say, oh, well, I disagree with your conclusion, therefore I'm going to discriminate against you. It's like, hang on. Like, I've actually thought about this carefully, and this is what I think is best.
I mean, it's a funny argument, because you can see the logic. You're like, okay, I see where you're doing there. But it's like, I don't really like either of those options.
Yeah, I mean, we could give a school bully analogy. There's the school bully who just beats you up because he doesn't like you. But there's another school bully who beats you up unless you give him your lunch. Which one's better? You chose not to give him your lunch. You could have just given him your lunch and then you wouldn't have been beaten up.
Right.
Anyway.
Let's see what else he says.
Or the country you're born in. So it makes sense to judge people and categorize them on the basis of their religion. But the color of your skin or which country you happen to be born in is a silly basis for categorization. And if anything, it leads to far more persecution and bloodshed.
But are they?
I don't think that's
the
true.
idea that he's presenting is that there isn't racism in Islamic countries, or that Muslims aren't racists.
What?
And I don't know if that's an argument that he can make and hold as being true, because racism, intolerance, bigotry is a human condition. It's part of tribalism, and anytime you have tribalism, you're going to have some variation of this forms of intolerance. And I don't, from experience, don't know that there's a monopoly on that.
Yeah, I agree.
Consider the supposedly peace-loving religion of Buddhism. Burmese Buddhists persecute the Rohingya based on racial identity. Sinhalese Buddhists persecute the Tamils based on ethnic identity.
I mean, what I want to say about this is that that's all well and good. I mean, I guess what I should say is that's all terrible. But is there really less murder and abuse going on from Muslims on religious grounds than there is from these other people on racial grounds?
And I still would wonder if the racial grounds don't exist.
Yeah, there may be a racial element to some of the violence that Muslims get up to.
That the racial element, that they're only judging on religion, I don't know that you can make that argument. Now, whether that argument is intrinsic in Muslims, the question is the racial discrimination that's being portrayed here by the Buddhists, is that part of their religion? Because what he's describing is part of his religion.
Yeah, we're going to want to say that these Buddhists aren't following Buddhism, and the Muslims that are doing that kind of violence aren't following Islam. I'm cool with all that.
Might be following Islam. My argument is that he's included in his religion, and you can probably support that through the religious text itself. That it is more intolerant of other religious traditions. Yeah. And so, is racism actually built into the Buddhism that the Bhutanese and the Sri Lankans are, or is that an exhibition of human nature that is corrupting their Buddhism?
Yeah, and like, I mean, again, I really don't think that it's worse. Like, you come into someone's house and murder them and murder their children or whatever. Does it really make any difference that you did it because you disagree with their religion than you did it because you don't like the color of their skin? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Identity. Japanese Buddhists justified Japanese imperialism based on ethno-nationalist identity.
So yes, none of these are religious.
Yeah, exactly.
Religious conflicts per se, but that's because the persecution is ethno-nationalist in character.
And it's not just Buddhists that have to resort to lowly racism and ethno-nationalism. Look at Christian white nationalists. Look at Jewish Zionists. Look at Hindutva. All these religious groups put primacy on race and discriminate based on race. This is not a coincidence. It's a byproduct of the weak conviction polytheism produces. The fact that these polytheistic religions don't admit this and pretend to be all about peace and tolerance while criticizing Islam is very dishonest.
I still don't understand how he's putting Christianity and Judaism in the polytheism category.
Yeah, I mean, he gave some weird arguments for that earlier on in the video.
Yeah, I didn't get it.
Me either. But again, it's just that thing of like, if we did a body count, I don't think Islam fares well.
No.
So these arguments are just weird.
It's not surprising that all these polytheistic religions come together to criticize Islam. Just look online. You see Christians obsessed with Islam, Jewish Zionists obsessed with Islam, Buddhist nationalists, Hindutva, and even atheists.
I mean, like he's got David Wood just there, and I know David Wood's explanation of why he does what he does, of so much criticism of Islam, is because he feels like one less Muslim in the world is potentially one less suicide bomber. That's his logic. I don't think you can blame him for thinking that.
No, I don't think you can.
All
That's the
seething
effect of
about
terrorism.
Sorry?
Well, that is the effect of terrorism. A certain group of Islam has decided to use terrorism as their methodology, and they have inadvertently colored people's perception of their whole religious tradition and everybody that's connected to it through terrorism. That's the effect of fear. That's what it does. That's what it did. And so, yeah, I agree with you. It's easy to understand that somebody could hold the view that one less Muslim is potentially one less suicide bomber.
Islam. You hardly see a Christian debunking Buddhist scripture or a Hindu deconstructing Jewish theology.
Yeah, for that reason we just gave. I don't care if there's more
I don't know
Buddhists in the
that's
world.
a good thing.
I don't care if there's more
that's
Jews
a
in the
bad thing.
world.
Excuse me.
It doesn't bother me if the Jewish religion spreads, because I don't think that increases the risk of any kind of violence in the world. And the same for Buddhism.
Yeah. Or Hinduism. Or, well, Christianity still a little on the violent side. But not so much in this day and age, generally speaking. But
not in most parts of the world, at least.
Yeah.
Why are they all focused on Islam? What's so telling is that these religions don't criticize Islam on the basis of their own traditional doctrines. Rather, their main criticism is that Islam is not liberal and modern enough. Islam does.
I mean,
you pretty much pointed out
there's other people who criticize Islam for not being liberal enough, obviously. But that's not why David Wood criticizes them.
Well, also, it's like the irony of it is, for example, Hinduism is being criticized for not criticizing Islam, whereas because from the perspective of Hinduism, there's room for Islam.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So what? Yeah.
So you're not a religious bigot. You're not bigoted enough, and therefore there's a flaw in there must be a flaw in your philosophy.
Well, what he's saying here is we're not criticizing Islam for diverging from our scriptures. We're criticizing them for diverging from the modern Overton window. So they're not woke enough, which is not why I criticize them, but some people criticize them for that.
Yeah, I think that the principal criticism towards Islam would be violence.
Doesn't respect women's rights like we do. Islam doesn't respect LGBT like we do. Islam is not as...
I mean, the women rights thing as definitely goes on. That's definitely a criticism.
Yeah.
Tolerant and freedom-loving as we are. These are nothing more than modern secular values that these other religions have sold out to. Liberal modernity is their true religion, and it just comes in a Christian, Jewish, Hindu, or Buddhist flavor. But as we've seen, Muslims can critique other religions based on Islamic standards of monotheism, which are so clearly more beautiful, more moral, and more intuitively compelling than the ugliness of polytheism. In contrast, these polytheistic religious doctrines are either too repugnant or too irrational to use to criticize Islam. So all they can do is cry about Islam not selling out to liberal secularism the same way they did. Deep down, they know their religion's all.
He's really clever rhetorician in how he's framing this all, eh?
I mean, I hold the irony that Hinduism is not going to attack Islam on the basis of its principles, other than perhaps in eating animals, because there's philosophical room that would include and have no issue with someone worshiping God as a Muslim.
All sold out, but Muslims haven't, and that burns them up inside. What makes them even more enraged is the fact that Muslims won't assimilate. Look at how agitated Christian white nationalists are about Muslim immigration. Look at how much anxiety Hindutva has about Muslim.
I mean, the recent stuff in Sweden has shown that the concerns about Muslim immigration were warranted.
Yeah.
Muslims converting and marrying Hindus. Look at how nervous Jewish Zionists are about Palestinian birth rates. Look at how incensed Buddhists in Myanmar are about their Muslim demographic. Look at how livid Western atheists get about Muslim minorities not accepting Western values. They're all terrified about the Muslim population growing. They're worried about Muslim conversion. They're nervous about strong Muslim commitment to Islamic law. All of these things are directly tied to the strong faith that Islamic monotheism produces that all.
I wonder if he actually believes what he's saying there.
I bet you he does. I would put pretty much all my money on that.
Right.
And I find it wow, what an interesting point of view.
I'm running low on time, so hopefully we can get to the end of this.
Yeah, no worries.
Oops.
These other religions lack. People assume that every religion is based on deep humility, love, and gratitude. But this is a very monotheistic understanding of religion. This psychology can only exist in polytheistic religions to a confused extent.
But profound, deep faith based on love, gratitude, and submission in their
Makes really
maximum,
absolute statements.
purest form
Yeah. Oh.
is only possible in Islam, because Islam directs these feelings solely toward our Creator.
So he makes a logical argument that, like, here's the philosophical worldview you need to have to make this possible. And then he pretends that Islam's the only one who has those philosophical principles.
Yeah.
This makes Islam the most beautiful religion, the most just religion, whereas polytheists commit the worst injustice by devoting themselves to false gods.
This is one of the most watched parts of the videos according to YouTube, so let's see if it's any good.
Ultimately, these other religions, what they're selling you is come be a Christian, come be a Jew, Buddhist, Hindu, because we're more liberal.
I think Hare Krishnas in the West have some of the highest expectations for followers in terms of adjusting your lifestyle.
I think that that they'll be conservative, like if you're going to be Amish, you're going to be Amish, and it's going to be, like, I think you're going to find the orthodoxy, there's going to be liberal and more, again, this is fairly universal, that you're going to have very orthodox and very liberal groups within every one of these traditions.
Yeah, exactly.
On the spectrum. Within Islam, there's going to be a spectrum of like really fanatical and then the sort of moderate Muslim. And that's a spectrum within Islam. And you can argue, maybe it's more conservative than the spectrum in Christianity or the spectrum in Judaism, but there's always going to be a spectrum. And there's might be within each of these traditions groups that are more willing to appeal to the masses in some way or another to, amass money or followers or so on and so forth. And that would, again, this seems universal.
You can indulge in more fornication. You can indulge in more freedom. You can walk around naked in public. The only selling point of these religions is we're not as bad as Islam.
Only.
But Islam has...
Selling point.
Anyway, I don't even think we need to comment on that one.
A positive message. Islam offers Tawheed, a pure monotheism that creates strong faith connecting you to your Creator, unshakable faith that can motivate you to stand up against the evil modernist onslaught.
Because I think think if you could find every single one of these religious traditions would probably have a branch of their tradition that would have a similar attitude towards the you could say the encroachment of modern progressivism in their religious traditions.
Totally.
And that all of them will have a segment of their faith that will view these similar ideas that he's complaining about with some trepidation at the very best, or at least.
These are Islam's values, and these are the values that should guide human life. These are the values that allow Muslims to resist colonization, to resist secularization, to resist assimilation, and to resist the transhumanist liberalization agenda that threatens to destroy all mankind. Islam stands alone.
That's a bold statement.
And it's all because of one belief. There is no God except Allah.
Yeah, he says it like there's the only ones who believe in one God.
Yeah.
I think that's the end of it. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
So now we'll go to the really vulgar bit.
According to ancient Aztec priests, the god Tlaloc required continuous human sacrifice. If these sacrifices were not made, the rain would stop and the crops would die. But Tlaloc especially needed child sacrifice, and it was not enough to wet the earth with the blood of children. Tlaloc also required their tears. If the sacrificial children did not cry enough, the priests would pull out their teeth or their nails to ensure maximum screams of pain before ritually sacrificing them.
Do you have any comments on any of that?
I don't know if it's true or not true, and I don't know that we would even be able to know if it's true or not true, because everything that we know about the Aztecs is going to be coming more or less through Christian missionaries, and so I don't know if it's biased or unbiased, or I don't know.
Yeah, and again, we could agree with his criticisms here, and it would be no skin off our back.
Absolutely. Certainly, we wouldn't glorify the characterization that he's presenting.
Yeah.
There is a sacred ritual described in Hindu scripture that's so vulgar that Hindu scholars refuse to translate it. Later Western...
Do you want to start by commenting on that bit?
I
refuse to translate it?
I find that fairly rich. I mean, there's the sections of Harivamsa that he's probably going to refer to are translated.
Well, he's going to say they're whitewashed translations.
Well, unless he's going to show us the Sanskrit and prove to us that he actually has a grip of the language himself, good friggin' luck.
What he's done is read a book from someone who's quite critical of Hinduism and taken the worst bit out of the book, the most damning part for Hinduism out of the book.
And probably characterized and translated himself in the way that's the most damning possible as well, which is fairly typical of the colonialists who interacted with India as well.
Academics like Wendy Doniger have provided full translations of the Hindu...
I tried to...
Again, he's putting forth a translation and a presentation that is not coming from within the Hindu tradition. It has no context within the Hindu tradition. It has no oral tradition attached to explaining what's going on from within the Hindu tradition. That would be like if we characterize Islam based on a Christian who is not a Muslim, who has no understanding of, well, I can't say that she has no understanding, but she's not part of that tradition. She's purely looking at it from an academic. And I don't know that that would be a fair way to characterize or to assess Islam.
I tried to email Wendy Doninger to ask her, can you please tell me what the actual Sanskrit is for whatever he's referencing from your work? I didn't get a reply. I don't know if she got the email. I tried.
Sacred Veda scriptures that describe this shocking fertility ritual called the Ashvamedha.
We will describe the ritual for you now, along with direct quotes from the scriptures, but viewer discretion
He says direct quotes, but he never showed any Sanskrit.
Yeah.
is advised.
The ritual begins when a horse is suffocated to death. The king and
that's
his
not when the
four
ritual
queens.
begins. So we already know that this is ritual. He's already describing it wrong. The ritual begins with releasing a horse. The horse is let loose and to roam the land for 1 year. The horse is followed and more or less protected, and he's allowed to go wherever he wants to go for a year. That's the beginning of this ritual.
Walk around the dead horse chanting.
But is the horse suffocated to death?
In Ramayana, the horse is killed with a scimitar. So again, he's going to quote the Ramayana, and he's not going to describe the ritual that's described in the Ramayana.
Yeah, he pretends like the version he's describing is what happens in the Ramayana, but
Well, it's not.
yeah.
Prayers. The chief queen recites, "O horse, you are protector of the community on the basis of your good qualities.
So when,
you are
when
the
they're,
protector."
first of all, they're describing a horse, but he's taking it 100% literal. So he's about to describe a ritual, which is a symbolic reenactment of something, right? Like, you know, when we discussed this before, where you talked about the Christian ritual of Eucharist, where you receive the Eucharist and it's the body of Christ. You're not literally eating this is not where we're like cannibalizing Jesus. There's meaning there. And that's what we're engaging in, right? This is the nature of ritual. It's a symbolic it's symbolic. So the horse that's being described is the Ashva is it's related to the sun. It's the movement of the sun, and the sun is the giver of prana. The horse is the prana that activates the senses and gives forth life. And so the horse is the embodiment of this solar principle that's going on. It's when these mantras are being chanted to, the horse is embodying a principle, and they're worshiping a principle that is something grander than the horse.
Right, but are these an accurate description of what happens in the ritual?
The horse is most definitely killed in the sacrifice.
Of happiness. O horse, you have become my husband. When the prayer is complete.
So it's again, the horse that's being described is not the animal, is the symbolic representation of what's happening. When they're worshiping through this mantra, they're actually referring to the giver of life through of God through the sun. And the sun being the source of prana, and all virility and all fecundity is coming from the sun. Life is coming from the sun, and this is a ritual of this is usually enacted. If you academically say it's a fertility ritual, but there's a lot going on.
The chief queen lies down next to the horse. As the priests observe, she pulls the dead horse's genitalia and puts it into her own. She then recites
this personally. Although in Harivamsa, a situation like this does take place, but it must be noted that Janamejaya becomes shocked. He actually curses the queen. In the story in Harivamsa, Indra enters into the horse, and Urvasi, the nymph, enters into and sort of possesses the queen. And so the love affair between Urvasi and Indra is taking place, and it appears as if the queen is doing something inappropriate with the horse. And Janamejaya, the king, becomes shocked. He's like, "Oh my God, what is this? This is terrible." And he's going to curse the queen, and he makes a declaration that there will be no more Ashvamedas. So Ashvamedha, even the attack here, even if we were to take it on face value, the reality is that Ashvamedha is not part of Hinduism today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not something that's going on. Whereas
it's irrelevant.
Honor killings are still happening in Canada today.
Yeah.
And so is a lot of violence in Islamic countries.
So, I mean, he's describing a ritual without any real context. And he is, the reality is the mantras that are for the Ashvamedha are in Yajurveda, and they're in archaic Sanskrit. And the 4 Vedas in general are deeply coded. They are not literal. They're coded majorly. And the Upanishads are often the decoding of the meaning of the Veda themselves. And there isn't an oral tradition that I'm aware of today that can be gone to understand the meaning of the sacrifice as it's presented. So all we have is speculation, academic speculation, Hindu speculation, all kinds of speculation about what all this all means. There are whole books written on the symbolism that's involved in the Ashvamedha, and all of it, of course, still on the platform of educated speculation. But this is really neither here nor there, because this is not a living tradition within India today. In fact, I mean, I suppose you would still have blood sacrifice in Shakta traditions of sacrificing goats, but there's still sacrificing goats in Islam, so it's pretty much the same.
Right. So what he's doing here is basically just trying to get a shock value. He's describing something which, as if it's like, it's in a manual of here's how you carry out this ritual and here's something a good Hindu's supposed to do. But we're not aware of any Sanskrit verse that says here's a ritual that should be performed. You're aware of one version where something similar is described, and this is a historical case where everyone's shocked that this happened.
Yeah. Which also says that it was not the norm for the ritual, because if the king was not, if he knew that was going to be, that's the ritual, why would he be shocked? Why would he be surprised to the point of cursing his wife, right? So obviously that wasn't the norm for the tradition.
So probably what's happening is he's doing really sloppy research, which we can blame him for.
And also he's assuming that the Hindus have whitewashed it. So he's gone to the Ramayana. If you go to the Ramayana, you can still go to the Ramayana. You can find the critical edition. You can go to the chapter that describes the sacrifice, and it is bloody. For modern Hare Krishna would go and read how Ram was invoked into the world. They'll be shocked.
But there's no bestiality.
It is gnarly, but it doesn't involve bestiality. It does involve sacrificing horse.
Right.
And 22 other animals.
Sacred prayer, this horse may release semen into me. The king.
He's using the word semen, but the word that's most likely to be is either shukra or virya, and both of those have double meaning.
Right. Yeah. So it could just mean
like potency. He's receiving the prana, so you're receiving the potency of you're asking for the sun to imbue you, your land, everything with the potency to, that's essentially what's being, without being able to see the Sanskrit, but I would assume, knowing Sanskrit enough.
Right. I mean, I reached out to one scholar who then reached out on my behalf to many other scholars. Nobody was able to show us Sanskrit that says anything close to this.
Yeah.
So if someone wants to give us a verse, or if he's watching this and wants to give us a verse, then please do. But so far, it seems like he's either done really sloppy research and come to false conclusions, or he's
even
knowingly.
If it was written like that, it's like, what does it mean? And is it's not literal?
Yeah, or he's knowingly misrepresenting.
Yeah, he's knowingly misrepresenting it.
Make it appear
in the same way that it's not literal. We're not literally eating the body of Christ.
Yeah, what he's doing here is probably similar to if you said, "Oh, but Jesus said you're supposed to eat his body," so that's cannibalism.
Yeah, exactly. It's immature.
Another sacred prayer, "O horse, please throw semen on the upper part of the anus of my wife. Expand your penis and insert it in the vagina." According to the Harivamsa Purana, the Hindu god Indra eventually enters the body of the dead horse to have intercourse with the queen as the king watches. The ritual is
He doesn't tell
complete
the rest of
after the
story. So in the rest of the story, the Apsara, which is like a celestial nymph, enters into the wife, and the nymph is already Indra's consort, and so they engage in a in intimacy, and the king is like, what the heck is going on here? He doesn't realize that that's what's happened, that actually he's invoked devas and they've come, and so he's gonna curse his wife. He curses the Ashvamedha. He's like, this is it. Every time people do Ashvamedha, everything goes wrong. Ram did it, lost everything. My grandfather did it. How much problems happened because he did it. He lists all the times that it's done and how many problems for Prithu Maharaj and so on and so forth. And then he's about to curse his wife, and then Indra manifests and says, no, actually, your wife had nothing to do with this. This isn't what it does. This is not what it appears to be. His words. Okay. His words are, this is not what it appears to be. So hold your judgment and hold your wrath. You don't understand what's happening here.
Right.
Your wife is faultless, and it was me and Urvasi. So now he'll obviously, his argument would be, well, your gods take the form of horses and blah 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 blah. But again, there's meaning there, and it has to do with prana, about the energy that invigorates the senses. And that's why Indra is involved in that Leela. There's meaning in there.
Queen spends the whole night with the dead horse's genitalia inside her, thus ensuring fertility for the Hindu kingdom. In one instance, the mother of Rama is also reported to have participated in this special ritual.
Yeah, so he said that he participated in this special ritual as if that's how the ritual went when she did it.
But what I heard it described as she ate some what was the sweet rice?
Yeah, she gets sweet rice at the end.
And that,
but first part of the sacrifice is a horse sacrifice. That's the first part of the sacrifice. That's there, 100%.
But her engagement in the ritual is attending it and then eating the sweet rice. That's what.
And she's the one that kills the horse.
Oh, okay, right.
So they go through. They worship the horse. They worship all the deities in the horse. Like, sometimes you hear the description of the devas in the various parts of the body of a cow and so on and so forth. So the horse is worshipped. The horse is let go for a year. It wanders for a year. Then it comes back. And then there's the whole ritual of worshiping the horse, making the horse completely pacified and peaceful. Then they touch the horse in various parts of his body, and they're chanting various mantras. And then it describes her putting her hand on the horse and reassuring the horse. When the horse is at its completely most peaceful state, where it's completely, then she takes like what describes her taking a scimitar, more or less, and chopping off the head of this horse. And then it goes something along the line. Like, yeah, it goes. It is what it is. It's a horse sacrifice. And then once the sacrifice is complete, then Agni comes out of the fire, and he has the pot of the sweet rice that the queens all receive. That becomes the fruit of the sacrifice. When it's all finished, Agni comes out of the fire and gives this pot of the sweet rice. That's the fruit of the fire. That's the phala.
Right.
You might think that this is a marginal practice in Hinduism, but many sacred Hindu temples, such as the Khajuraho temple in India, depict these acts of bestiality and group sex on their holy walls.
So there's Khajuraho is famous, but there's like maybe one other temple that I'm aware of that's as famous in this way of this erotic sculptures. The idea that this is like he's trying to paint this as pervasive within Hinduism is very
right.
ridiculous. And the Ashvamedha is not a sacrifice that has been performed since Janamajaya, which would be somewhere around, 3,000 years ago.
Whereas
or more
today
actually.
in the Middle East, there's some horrendous violence and abuse going on still in Islamic countries.
Yeah. And there's, I go back to, there's horrendous abuse going on in Buddhist cultures.
Oh yeah, we're not picking on Islam especially. We're just pointing out how odd it is for him to make these arguments.
It's the hypocrisy is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's gross hypocrisy, and it's taking an elitist position that nobody should be able to take.
Yeah.
Now you could say that all religions are the same.
Okay, that's where we started from. So we've done the whole video now. This is making me I'm almost regretting responding to such poor quality content. I much prefer responding to actual sincere high class intellectuals like I usually do.
I mean, it's it's not it's not intellectually sound, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'll wrap it up there. I'll probably, I don't know if I'll find time to edit this video down, but I'll at least post the full length of it somewhere. I might just end up putting the whole thing on my main channel. I'll see.
Whatever you do, you can use it, not use it, whatever you do. It's
I'll definitely use it. It's just, yeah, it's a lot of work making a 20-minute video about something like this. What I would have helped if I just picked out a few clips we wanted to react to, but yeah, anyway, it's good stuff. It's definitely glad I had you on for it. You're good at this content.